Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the first speaker in our spring speaker series of the Criminology Forum, which is sponsored by the Department of Sociology and Criminology, as well as the Criminal Justice Research Center. We have been trying the past couple years every spring to have a special session directed at non-academic careers. We were to have two speakers today, but unfortunately one of our speakers has taken very ill and is not able to join us. So I have informed Dr. Alexia Cooper that she just needs to talk much longer than anticipated. And I hope we have a fruitful conversation with many questions for her. Dr. Cooper is currently the chief of the Law Enforcement Statistics Unit for the United States Department Bureau of Justice Statistics. She's an experienced project manager, having worked there since 2011, and has over 20 years of experience overall in conducting social science data collection and research. Since joining BJS, her work has covered a wide variety of criminal justice topics. I don't want to miss these, so I'm going to check my notes, including working with law enforcement administrative data collections, the FBI's UCR data, directing the NCSX National Estimation Project, and the National Crime Statistics Exchange Program. She's responsible for designing, evaluating, and implementing a wide range of formula grants. One I'm particularly familiar with is the Edward Byrne Justice Assistant Grant, we call the JAG program. In Pennsylvania, they call it the Dixie program for some weird reason. But I actually had funding from that back in the day when I worked outside of academia in juvenile justice. So in addition, she has published many excellent reports for BJS, and her work also appears in peer-reviewed academic journals such as Behavioral Science and the Law and Child Maltreatment. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Cooper to talk to you about her experiences using her PhD in the private sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me just say thank you for inviting me and for having me as a speaker today. I am particularly passionate about this topic because it's often a hard one, and I'm thrilled that your department is supporting this kind of outreach and helping their students think a little bit beyond the more traditional academia oriented. I have no idea how people want to do questions. I'm assuming that participants are muted and that questions will come in through the Q&A, but I will assume that someone will tell me if there are any questions. But today I don't have a super formal talk. I'm not going to have any slides, but I just want to talk with you guys a little bit about my background, how I got from academic to non-academic work, and then talk a little bit about jobs for non-academic roles in the federal government, how one might go about getting one, how they're a little different than other types of jobs you might have applied for, be more familiar with, and just some things to keep in mind as you move forward in your career and think about where you want to go. I myself, as Dr. Kurlichek mentioned, have been with the federal government almost 13 years. I started there as a basic statistician and worked my way up to the supervisor of the Law Enforcement Statistics Unit. During that role, I've had many opportunities to do a wide variety of work. And I think that that's one of the most important things about federal employment as someone with an academic background, is that there are a lot of different roles and a lot of different things that one can do. My background is actually not in criminology, which is odd, but it will make sense in a minute. My PhD is actually in developmental psychology. I did my undergraduate at UC Berkeley with a psychology degree, and then got my graduate degree at UC Irvine, also in California. One of the things that was true of my university, as well as the one that you are likely attending, is that there was a heavy emphasis on ensuring that our work was of use to more than the academic community. There was a lot of interest in maintaining connections with the community, with maintaining connections with a number of things. And so I personally started my non-academic work by getting an internship with the local Superior Court. And I ended up working with the local Superior Court as an analyst for almost 4 or 5 years. That came in through my university. There was an announcement, I put in a resume and they picked me, which I'm eternally grateful for. But it was a little bit of a struggle at first. We didn't have a lot of people working outside. And so my university didn't know how to handle it sometimes. My advisor didn't know how to handle it sometimes. But nonetheless, it gave me a lot of experience with understanding how academic attitudes, style of research, approaches could be utilized in non-academic settings. And then from there, I got an internship with the federal government in the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics. And then I came back as a full-time employee. I would say that one of the most important things to think about as you are just trying to think about where you want to go with your degree and what approach you want to take is that non-academic work is very broad. In the federal government, there is an extraordinarily large number of opportunities for people with educational backgrounds. And a lot of the challenge is trying to identify what kind of job you're interested in doing and how you want to apply the skills that you have and the background you have into something you're interested in doing. They are not often well known, but there are peer research opportunities in the federal government. But in terms of things that don't require peer research, I would say there's probably 4 or 5 job series. The federal government works on job series, which is to say they classify jobs in groups. And each of those groups shares certain levels of requirements. Most of the time, those requirements are educational based, but they can also be experience based or a combination thereof. And so with that in mind, there are quite a few different avenues for those. The one that my agency has is what's called a social science statistician. That sounds very, very math-based and very academic-based, but it does not require a PhD. I would say that of the 40 or so statisticians in our office, only about half, maybe a third, have PhD. Most of the rest do have masters, but a few of them don't. The requirement is not having the degree, but it's based on the number of units. So if you go looking for a federal job, usually there'll be a section that will ask you about your qualifications, and it will say what the requirements are, and it will list them in units. So 32 credit hours of social science or math or statistics, and it's very broad. There are a lot of things you can use to apply for those things. So it's really important to think about what classes you've taken and where they might fit in some of these things, because that's the first thing you have to do. If you can't get into that level, you can't get the job. And a lot of times the people who are doing those reviews for basic qualifications are not people like me who know what you're doing or know your background. They are an HR person who does not know the difference between a math class and a social class. And that can actually be really challenging at times. I'll come back to that in a second about how to sort of build a resume to do those. But most of the jobs in the federal government require that you have some level of academic background and can meet the minimum credit requirements. In addition to the social science statistician, there are social science analysts, which are usually positions that are a little bit more oriented towards program management and a little less oriented towards direct research. So, for example, in my office, our social science statisticians are responsible for running projects, running actual analyses, and writing reports. Our sister office, the National Institute of Justice, for example, has social science analysts, which have almost the same requirements in terms of the number of credit hours that they require, but their people are more project management. They oversee grants that go for academics, for example. And so it's really important to think a little bit, and when you go to these kinds of jobs, look at what kind of role you're interested in taking. There's also basic program management jobs where you could be doing budget related work if that's something you're interested in. So it's a very broad kind of thing. I will say that there is a lot of challenge in working for the federal government or a state government because they have similar kinds of roles. We often are tied to budget cycles with the federal government, and our work can often be put on hold or even canceled if the federal budget cycle doesn't match what we wanted to do, or a project doesn't get approved for funding. Often what we do can be linked to the administration. And so that's something else to consider, is that within whatever agency you're interested, how much are they protected or linked to the actual administration in charge? An entity like mine is actually a acknowledged statistical agency like the US Census Bureau, which means we are fully protected by census and the statutes covering statistical agencies. No one can tell us what to publish or what not to publish. They can tell us what we have priority, but if we want to put out numbers, we put them out. There are other agencies within the federal government that might have an analyst where they get told, we want to know what the answer to this number is. And if they don't like what they hear, they may not release it, or they may have you do something else. So thinking a little bit about the agency that you're interested in and what kinds of role you might have and what kinds of things you might have to do can often be very valuable when you're assessing where you want to take your career. There are a number of federal statistical agencies. Census Bureau is enormous and hires quite a few PhDs and master's students. They also take people who are basic mathematicians all the way up to program managers. So that's another avenue where there's a huge market for people who understand how to engage in basic science. I would say that when you're thinking about the skills and qualifications, although there's a wide range, most of the time, my experience has been that what federal agencies are looking for is people who can demonstrate that they understand scientific principles, that they understand how to administer and use those in a variety of things rather than just a single task, that they're capable of writing. That is a huge qualification question. And that they are interested, or at least have some interest in the general area that they're applying for. That one is not a deal breaker. I will say in the most recent round of hiring my agency did, we had people from all the way from pure PhDs in criminology to a couple of economists. And we even had one geologist apply. And we reviewed all those resumes and they all got interviews because what we were looking for was individuals who had enough credit hours in math, statistics, social sciences to demonstrate that they knew how to run an analysis or evaluate an analysis. And we were interested in looking for people who knew how to manage projects, who knew how to take work from the start to the end and would know how to lead that kind of project. We were not as interested or did not consider it mandatory that someone have experience directly in criminal justice or directly in law enforcement or victimization. It was a nice plus for some of the work, but it was not essential. And I think that's something that is also kind of a dirty little secret of non-academic work, is that in many cases, we are much more interested in the skills you have and how you can demonstrate those skills than we are that your background or your degree exactly matches the academic nature of the office. And so applying to jobs, don't be afraid to consider, if you really like the way the job sounds, but you think, okay, my degree isn't in demography, that might be okay. Throw your hat in the ring. You never know what they're looking for. And so I think that that's something to consider. In terms of the process for federal employment, it's a long one. Most federal jobs take a number of months to get. They all start with a program announcement, usually on USA Jobs. that will list out the job series. It will tell you what amount of money is involved. All of that is standardized with the federal government, and I'm happy to answer questions about that if people want, but it's detailed and usually boring for most people, but it's all standardized. You can look it up online. It will describe the office that a given role is in, and then it will describe the role and the specifics of that role. And that's a really important thing to pay attention to, because that's where the job is going to tell you how it differs from the base job of a social science statistician or a social science analyst or a program manager. It's going to tell you very specifically what they think that role will be doing. And that will tell you what they're looking for when they go to evaluate resumes. It will tell you what the requirements are. The requirement sections will always be split into two pieces. It will first have a section that talks about experience, and it will say something like at least 1 year at a similar GS grade in the federal government, because you can qualify with other experience. But then it will talk about education or other types of experience, which is normally what outside applicants will have. It will list the number of credit hours, if there are credit hours requirements for us and the other social science analysts and other kinds of analyst positions, so management program analysts, things of that nature. It's almost always somewhere between 12 and 32 hours of social science and methodology credit, which is very broad. That can include all kinds of coursework. And when you apply, you will be asked to supply your transcripts to demonstrate what courses actually meet those requirements. And it's really important that someone who does not know anything about the topic can review your materials and know what courses you are considering applies to what. They will not know necessarily that a GIS class is a methodology class, or that complex sample design is a math class, because that's not their area. And so you will have to have something that shows if you're trying to use that class to apply to the 32 credits by highlighting it or something like that. And then the last piece of the application will lay out specifics like whether or not there's any tuition reimbursement or move options, whether or not it's remote, in person, or hybrid, and whether or not there's any special requirements for applying for the job. Most of the time people apply through USA Jobs. You can actually set up a resume through USA Jobs and apply directly, and it will maintain all of your materials and have everything there. My office, which is the Office of Justice Programs, is a little different because we use a secondary site, which is a little bit more involved, but it does still start on USA Jobs. Federal resumes differ immensely from non-federal resumes. With your standard non-academic jobs, if you're trying to go get a job in an office, you'll be told 2 pages. With a federal resume, that will usually be a deal killer, because a federal resume, you need to establish and demonstrate what your experience is. It's not just sufficient to list the name of a job, because what's going to happen is when you make that application, an HR person is going to review it, and they're going to be looking for keywords. They're going to be looking for places where it's highlighted that you meet requirements that are listed in the application. They're not going to know, care, or understand if you don't explicitly say it. And so usually I advise, when I'm putting together a resume or evaluating resumes for federal employment, that in addition to using your standard non-federal, name of position, number of months held, who your supervisor was and how much it paid, also listing the accomplishments or key tasks that you were engaged in, and if they, led to anything. So for example, my resume would include that I was project management for the JAG grant, as Dr. Kurlichek mentioned. It will say in there, responsible for designing the formula, running it, and then I'll throw in there how much money I'm responsible for overseeing, because that tells any native reviewer details, and they go, oh, okay, this isn't just something they did on the side. This isn't just a minor thing. This is actually a big deal and it's really important. And the more that you are attempting to apply things on your resume that might be a bit of a reach, the better it is to put it in there. And it is absolutely essential to throw keywords in and make sure that your resume has words from the actual template for what you're actually applying for. Because again, somebody might be skimming that resume. In some cases, they even use electronic reviews. They'll be looking for those keywords. And if you don't meet those keywords, they'll throw your resume out and a person may never see it. So typically, I recommend that you think a little more broadly about a resume, write a little bit more than you might think is necessary. And most of the resumes I see are between 5 and 8 pages. And that is much more standard for a federal resume than you would see in the other situations. Let me see, I'm looking at my notes because I had some other things on here. Be prepared to not hear back for a while. Because of the amount of processing, because of the number of people involved, it can often take a long time to hear back on a federal job. It is not uncommon to have 2 or 3 months go by before someone hears anything. If you get an interview, they'll invite you for the interview, and then it might take another 3 months before you hear anything. With that in mind, we typically recommend that you start applying earlier than you think you might be interested. Because we require credit hours and not the actual degree, we actually have quite a few people in our office right now that are finishing their PhDs while they work for us. And that's perfectly okay because they qualified for the position without having that particular, without having that degree in hand. And so they can just do that on the side. And that is often something to consider, is sort of the timing on how you want to do it. Another thing to think about is experience. What kind of experience you have to put on a resume above and beyond your coursework. Coursework is great. Coursework is necessary. It's important, but it will not get you a federal job by itself. Most of the time, we're looking and we want to see how you've done things either outside of your coursework, or if all you have is coursework, what kind of things did you do in that course that would demonstrate that you can administer a project? So if you have no outside experience, but you had, say, a semester-long capstone project where you were responsible for designing a study and writing it up, say that, because that will tell me that you know how to write a study up. And if you just say XYZ course, we don't know what you did and we can't evaluate that. And we'll look at another resume where someone might have had an internship or something and say, okay, well, that one might rate a little bit more highly for us. Work experience is always good. I know it can often be really difficult if you're a full-time student to do outside work, but I can't recommend enough that experience working with data, working with people, working outside of just coursework can be really valuable in getting an academic job and moving forward. And at the end of the day, I would say that it's just really useful to think broadly about what it is that you're interested in doing, and then looking at agencies to see who does that. Don't pigeonhole yourself. Most federal jobs that have folks who come in with degrees are doing a lot of project management work. We do a lot of grant administration work in some cases. Some agencies do no grant administration work. Some just do analyses. Some do more analytics on the side of, like, the FBI has folks who do ops analysis. And so their job, while using an analytic background, is more on the read all these materials, summarize them, and provide a brief to someone else on what this might mean. All those jobs might actually have the same job series. So it's really important to think about what kinds of things you want to do in a day-to-day job and look for a federal agency or a job series where you're doing those things. Because life's too short to hate what you do. And, if you go through all of the effort to get into a federal job and then decide you don't like what you're doing, you can always change. It's easier to get another federal job once you've got one federal job, but it's a long process and it can be a real disappointment to discover that you don't actually like the agency that you've gotten into. So I think it's really important to spend a lot of time looking at various agencies to see what they do. And then I'll just say, reaching out to people like me. A lot of folks in the federal government are very willing to talk to people about their jobs and about what they do and about how they got there. At the end of the day, most civil servants, most people like me, came to the federal jobs, came to the employment we did because we wanted to make a difference, because we wanted to be part of something like that. And we wanted to do something different and push at goals that are different than you might in an academic environment. In some cases, like in my job, I wanted to have a platform to promote academic work because we have a lot of phenomenal academics that we work with, and our platform lets us help support them in doing their work. We can give out money to help support them, and then we take their published research and make it more broadly known, or we have them help us with work. So most of us are very willing to talk to people about how we got to where we got, what we were doing, and what our job is like. My agency offers informational interviews usually. If you call our agency and ask to talk to an analyst about our job, we will almost certainly set you up to talk to somebody. And they'll give you the good, the bad, and the ugly. And really help people make an informed decision about whether or not our agency is one that someone would be happy at. It takes a lot of money, time, and effort to hire, train, and bring someone on board. And we would rather know ahead of time that someone that we're hiring is eager, exciting, wants to work there, and we'll train them to do what we need them to do, than someone who might hate doing it as soon as they get in and then leave before a year's out. So I highly recommend that kind of approach as well. And at the end of the day, I will say that it's not for everyone. Just like academia is not for everyone, working in non-academic careers is not for everyone. It's not always going to be fun. There's a lot of paperwork involved. There's a lot of administrative actions involved. There's a lot of layers of information because federal government is nothing if not bureaucratic. But at the end of the day, most of the people that I work with love their job. Most of them have stayed for a very long time. I've been there 13 years, and I would say half of my office has been there longer than me. And I think that that says something about the work that we do and how much we enjoy it and why we want to promote it the way we do. I'm sure I can babble on longer, but I'm going to stop and see if anyone has any questions, or if Joy, you or Megan have anything you want me to talk about more, or anything of that nature.
Hi, yeah, we're gonna give some time for questions to come in if they come in through the chat, but I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your own personal trajectory. So if someone comes in like you did, right, at probably a basic statistician level or analyst level, what's that process like? And you went from that basic level to being chief of a really important unit in basically a 10-year time frame. So I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about, once you're in the door, what those opportunities look like.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, people can put questions in chat and Ashley will forward them.
Okay. Obviously, it's a little different at every agency, but at the heart, federal agencies work on what's called a grade system. So every federal job, with a few exceptions that don't really matter as much for this discussion, is graded in terms of how complex the job is, how difficult it is, and how high the requirement levels are. They run from, I think, GS3 all the way up to 15. And they're related to both the skills required, the how many credit hours, things of that nature, and how much they get paid. The higher the grade, the more you get paid. Most jobs that would require 32 or 40 hours of credit will start at what we call a GS9. My office starts at 9s usually. We do hire some, there's no 10s for some reason. So it's 9, 11, 12, 13, 14, and 15. Most of the time in my office, we hire people who are either new PhDs or who have a little bit of credit hours of experience, not necessarily people who've graduated but have put some time in. They come in as 9 or 11s. We
So for
assign
our
them.
students, what does a 9 or 11 mean for a pay? Because I'm
Oh,
sure that's a question they'll have. What does a 9 mean?
so if I remember correctly, and all of this is public information, and I can make sure you have links to all of this because it's all on the website. Like you can look up my salary if you really wanted to. When I last checked, including locality pay. So the federal government does have a base pay, and then they have a little bit of money that's called locality pay that differs depending on where your office is located. So my office is located in Washington, D.C. So we have, I think it's a 30% bonus on our salary because it's expensive to live in DC. So if I remember correctly, a GS9 is somewhere between 50 and 55,000 a year in DC. An 11 is 65 or 68. A 12 is 5 to 10 above that, 13 is 5 to 10 above that, and so on and so forth. So by the time you hit an 11 or 12, you're in the 80-ish thousand dollars, at least in DC range. And once you hit a 14, which is considered in most agencies the highest non-supervisio, those usually I think start at 110 or so. The other thing is that you also can get salary bumps within those grades. So within each of those grade levels is 10 what we call steps. So steps are 2,000 roughly dollar increments that you can go up. So you've come in as a, let's say a GS9 step 1 in DC and you make say $55,000 a year. Within a year, usually you'll go to step 2, you'll get an additional $2,000 on that. And that usually happens every year. In terms of promotions, most federal jobs, you can qualify at the base level after having been in the grade for a year. So if you come in as a 9, after a year as a 9, you qualify for an 11 in the same type of job or series. That doesn't necessarily mean you'll get hired in one, but you can apply for it and know that you've met the minimum requirements. So what a lot of people do with federal jobs is they'll come in with a job they can get and then look around and hop around from job to job, going up in grades as they move. That is completely viable approach. A lot of people do that. No one, to my knowledge, really looks down on that. Like we don't look at resumes and say, I don't want to hire this person because they've had 3 other jobs. We know that's just part of federal hiring. A better job, in my opinion, is there are jobs like my office have what are called series ladders, where it means you can be non-competitively promoted from that 9 to an 11, 11 to 12, 12 to 13, and so on. And so that's what happened for me is I came in as an 11 because I already had my master's, and my experience with the courts gave me a little bit of a boost from experience. So they brought me in as an 11. Within a year and a half, I was promoted non-competitively to a 12 because of the work that I had done and that I had made made progress, taken on additional tasks. And in my office, you can do that all the way up to a 14. Now, the higher you go in those grades, the more senior you're expected to be, the more role responsibilities you're expected to have. And you have to be able to demonstrate that you can do those things to get those promotions, even though they're non-competitive. So it's not like you'll automatically get a 14 if you've been a 13 for a year. Usually it takes a couple of years. But in my case, I was able to go from an 11 to a 14. And then when the 15 supervisor position came open, I was able to apply for it and be qualified because of all the work I had done in the office. And I was picked over other outside candidates because of my experience. So it's definitely possible. I like ladder jobs because you know where you can go without having to leave. And it's very common for people to get pay capped after a number of years because you hit a point where they can't give you more money in a grade. And so people will not necessarily want to leave their job, but they may have to go to a different position to get that higher grade, higher pay. And so having ladders like mine is really, really fantastic because we don't have to lose qualified people to give them more money. They can stay in the office and be promoted, get additional tasks and things. So let me go ahead and take a look. There's a number of questions. So are there opportunities to publish in peer-reviewed journals? Yes, there are. Every agency does it a little bit differently. However, I would say there's two different avenues. If you are working for an agency that has a less I hate to say academically oriented, but a less research oriented, that's a better way of putting it, agency than mine, most of the time you can publish independently outside of your office if you have those things you want to do. It requires that you get a waiver because you have to, your job basically has to have somebody say that you're not acting in conflict with your role. So for example, if I wanted to take BJS data and go publish on it, I can do that, but someone has to review it and make sure I didn't abuse my position to take data someone else couldn't have, for example. Or that I wasn't making statements about, things that didn't make sense. I've never heard of anyone in my agency being turned down for that. Most of the time in my agency, we actually promote it. We want people to be outside, to publish outside, and some people even can get granted small amounts of time while working in the office to do so. We also promote people doing it as part of their jobs. So in many cases, we will partner with researchers and on grants or in other funded avenues to come up with research projects that will help support, and we can get co-published on those kinds of things as well. So it is definitely an avenue that's an option, and many people do. Flexibility in the work, how flexible is the federal government on work location and work hours? What are the benefits like, in particular paid time off? So let me start with the first one. Some of these are very job specific. Some agencies have very strict duty hours, but most of the ones that I'm familiar with, you apply for a particular location. So you can't apply for somewhere and then say, I don't want to move out there, I'm just going to work remotely. Positions, when you go to apply for them, will tell you where the duty location is. They will tell you if you have the option for full-time remote work, and it will tell you if it's a hybrid, which means that you can telework as well as having in-person role. Because of the way the federal government is responding to telework right now, if you're familiar with that, I would say you should never count on a role being created as a non-remote position and allowing remote work. Telework, though, is something that is encouraged and supported. Most of the agencies that I know of, even federal law enforcement agencies, as long as you're not an agent, do support some degree of telework. Most of them have 1 to 2 days a week that they allow people to telework, depending on other circumstances. In terms of time for work, that again is agency specific. Most of the agencies I work with have very flexible schedules. So our core duty hours in DC are 6:30 a.m. to I think 8:30 p.m. And you can work with supervisor and agency approval, anything in that. We have a number of different what we call work schedules. So we have standard 9 to 5. I think it's 8, technically 8 to 5, whatever. Those kinds of really standard, and a lot of people work those. We also have people who work that kind of schedule, but they start at 7 and they end earlier, or they start late and later. That is supported in my agency. The other thing is we have a couple of what we call alternative work schedule options. where you work more in one day and can take time off in another day. So for example, if you know you have to go get your kids at 2 o'clock on Wednesdays, always, our agency allows people to say, okay, I'm going to work till 7, 3 days a week so that I can be off 3 hours early on this day. And the last kind of thing we offer is a standard alternative work schedule where you work an extra day, an hour or two every day, and then get a day or two, depending on which one you do, every week. So in my case, I work 9 days out of every 10 and get the 10th day off because I work an extra hour. In terms of benefits, a lot of these are standardized across the federal government, and I can try to find links for people if they're interested. But my memory and understanding is all federal positions offer paid time off, paid sick leave. That is usually, if you're in a GS schedule, dictated by your grade and time and grade. So when you start, you get 4 hours of paid sick leave and 4 hours of paid vacation every 2 weeks. And then that goes up to 6 hours after you've been there. It's either 3 years or 5 years, I can't remember which. And then it goes up to 8 hours after 15. So if you've been there 15 years, you get 8 hours of leave every pay period. You also have paid parental leave. That's federal mandated. There's options for other kinds of things depending on federal requirements. But for example, federal maternity leave or parental leave is a thing, bereavement leave exists. There are a lot of things like that. Healthcare is provided, those kinds of things are all inherent. And I can make sure people have links to that. Next question that came up is, can I tell you where, in addition to job postings on USA Jobs, you can find more information about the different roles available within the federal government? So all of the information about grades and series are available on the Office of Personnel and Management, OPM website. That is going to be a really technical guide, but you'll be able to find them there. It will tell you all the job series, and it will give you an idea of what kinds of jobs fall into those. If you're interested in particular types of series, you can also ask someone like me, and I will help try to figure it out for you. But the other thing you can find is a lot of agencies will, if not be part of professional organizations, they'll be associated with their professional organizations, and they'll post their openings with those professional organizations. So in my agency's case, we obviously work closely with the National Correctional Association. We work with the International Chiefs of Police. We work with the ASC, American Criminology Conferences. And so when we have a job opening, we'll email it out to everybody in hopes that we get a broad, good candidate mix. And I know a lot of the agencies do that too. And a lot of places are also utilizing LinkedIn. So they'll send out a posting via LinkedIn, as most agencies have something associated with those. And I think that would, that's another avenue you can use to find these kinds of jobs. Any other questions?
Well, they asked about publishing. What about conferences? Are you allowed to attend any conferences if you wanted to, if you're presenting?
Yeah, so I can speak for my umbrella agency. So OJP, which is the umbrella agency that oversees mine, oversees 3 or 4 other research-oriented agencies: the National Institute of Justice, the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, Bureau of Justice Statistics, Office of Violence Against Crime, and Office of Violence Against Women. All of those interact with their various professional organizations. And we do have the ability to go to conferences. We're in fact encouraged to go to conferences. In times where budgets are slim, usually we only get to go if we're presenting, but we are encouraged to try to present on BJS data. And if we can, then they pay for us to attend. So my agency, ASC, is the big one, the big criminology conference every year. Most of our people will attend every year. Most of our people will present on some BJS data every year. But depending on the area, we'll present in other places. So one of my staff members works on medical legal deaths. So he does stuff with forensic coroners, and things of that nature. And he's going to a conference on forensics next month and is going to be presenting on our census of medical examiners at that conference. And I know a number of our correctional unit staff will go to correctional conferences and present at correctional conferences. We try to send people to conferences if you're not presenting, if it's an important conference or something that's useful for both your job and you. But particularly when budgets are tight, we sometimes do have to limit it to presenters only. That said, in my organization, we want people to be experts in their field. If you don't come in as an expert, we want you to become one. I didn't know anything about criminology really when I came into BJS because my background was in developmental psychology. I had worked with the legal institution because I had worked a lot with juveniles involved in the justice system and with courts and things of that nature, but I didn't know the federal government's approach to it. I learned on the job, and I learned well. Obviously, I'm still there. And they sent me to conferences. They encouraged me to publish. They encouraged me to finish my dissertation. We want people to become an expert in their field that people can trust to answer questions, to do research, beyond, above and beyond. One of the unique things about being a federal researcher is that your work is very broad and it has to meet a lot of different needs. So we try to make all our data available. We try to make all our information available for researchers because we really want people to do analyses with our stuff. We want people to be able to take it and do cool research projects that we can talk about. But we also need to be able to make sure that our Congress members have the information that they need. It is not uncommon for us to get phone calls where Congress members will say, hey, you have this study on prisons. I need to know what the prison rate is, how many prisoners there are in any given time, and what's the gender and ethnic breakdown of those things. And I need it in 5 minutes. And so we have to make sure that our data and our information is available and accessible and understandable. We get media requests. We get interviewed by media sometimes. So we have to be able to speak to those different levels. And so our folks need to be able to do more than just run the studies. We have to be able to talk about the work that we do to an extraordinarily broad range of folks. And that's really attractive for some people and really intimidating for others. And we'll work with folks if they come in and don't feel comfortable doing those kinds of things. But it's really important that our people are capable of doing that kind of stuff. Oh, this is an interesting question. Okay, how does our work change depending on the administration? So for example, how have priorities changed between Trump and Biden administration? This is one of those questions that the experience is going to vary dramatically by what agency you're in and whether or not you are part of which branch of government you're in. If you, for example, are an analyst with a federal law enforcement agency, let's say Coast Guard, you won't necessarily have the ability to do whatever you want, and you might have more strictures. If you're working for one of the federal statistical agencies like mine, we can publish whatever we want, whenever we want, and no one can tell us we can't. But what does happen is what our focuses are can change, what they want to pay for us to do. So generally, what I would say is under the Trump administration, there was a lot of interest in numbers associated with the various types of law enforcement corrections. They really wanted to know a lot about who was in prison, how did they get there? They wanted to know how long are people there and what are, those kinds of things. Under the Biden administration, we often get asked more about what happened that got people in, or what kinds of things happen when they come out, or what things might drive those kinds of people going into prison or coming out of prison. Now, our agency doesn't answer those questions as to the why, but we do try to collect the information to allow people to make those decisions. So generally, what I would say is if you're in an agency that has some protections, like a federal statistical agency, the day-to-day work we do doesn't change. The way and the amount and the stuff that we publish is not directly influenced, but the nature of the projects we work on can. Did that answer the question? I don't want to like get off it, but I want to make sure that the answer was fully, fully provided. Well, I'm not seeing a response, so I will think yes. Let's see. Any other questions or anything else you want me to touch on? I know we're coming up on the end of the hour.
I see a response that says, yes, thank you so much. So I think you did answer the question. I don't see, let me put my camera back on here, not we're at the end. If it will go back on, perhaps it shall not. I'm really here. Anyway, there we go. I want to thank everyone so much for coming, and I really want to thank Dr. Cooper for this informative presentation. A lot of the ones we have in the past have focused really specifically on their career, and this one was a little different, and where it was more informative on how to apply for jobs. And I think a couple of things that Dr. Cooper said that are really important and interesting are about the website you can go to, and that she's going to provide us with some links, which we'll put up. Joy will help me get them up, I assume, on the Criminal Justice Research Center website for you. But also just the detailed information on how a resume might be different, and what you need to put in that resume, and think about not just saying I took a course, but here's what we did in the course, or here's what I accomplished. I think that's really good advice. And I don't think our students get that kind of detailed advice often. So I'm very appreciative of your time today. And we may bug you in the future because don't do your job too well, because you know what happens. You get asked to do it again.
I am more than happy to. Even though I'm not in the academic environment anymore, the thing I enjoyed the most was interacting with the students. And I feel very passionately that people should feel comfortable to talk with their advisors in their university about what the options are, and not feel like they have to do one thing. I know my institution was an R1. They were not interested in non-academic jobs. They really wanted to produce researchers, and it became kind of a dirty little secret when people got work that wasn't an academic job. And so it made it really tough. And I think that it's a great opportunity for a lot of people. And I would also say, as just a parting thought, it doesn't preclude someone from changing their mind. We have folks who leave our agency and go on to academic jobs. And we have academics who come and join our agency after a number of years in an academic position. So, just because you're drawn to one or the other, it doesn't preclude you from changing later. And so I think it's really valuable to keep your options open, to think broadly, and to just try and think about what will make you satisfied in your job career. And I'm happy to talk to any of your students in the future in any way that I can help.
Thank you. And Alexia, that I worked at the Senate first, and then I worked for the National Center for Juvenile Justice. So I worked in policy before I went into academia. When I was at Albany, we hired people that had worked in policy, and I know people that have gone the other way. Alex Picuro went from academia to being a director at NIH.
And then back to academia.
And then back to academia. So one doesn't preclude the other. It's not a one-way road. So thank you so much for your time. And I hope that the students will reach out to you, and we'll be in continued contact. Thank you so much.